Good afternoon. Welcome back to Mae Sot, Thailand. It is 2 o'clock in the afternoon here, and that means it is time for lunch. I'm not actually a big lunch eater. I will often skip lunch. I'm kind of a one meal a day person. But having lunch is a good opportunity to, again, get out into the city, walk around, and find a new place to have something to eat. I'm probably not going to have a big meal. I have my eye on another local restaurant that I've walked past a few times, but I've never actually gone in and had anything to eat there. So I'm going to head in this direction where I think the restaurant is located, and I'll see what they have on offer. I'll probably end up with a small dish again, so like a small meal, kind of a simple dish of rice and veggies, or noodles and veggies, something like that. We'll see what happens when I get there. This restaurant I'm thinking of is on the main street, the one behind me, but I thought I would go there in kind of a roundabout route, take some of the smaller lanes through Mae Sot just to stretch my legs and clear my head before I get to the restaurant. And the path I'm following is taking me past this large stupa near my guest house. I never thought of it before, but I read something online that said that this temple, this stupa, is modeled on the famous Shwedagon temple in Yangon in Myanmar. And that makes a lot of sense to me now, now that I'm looking at it. It was raining quite a bit earlier today. I heard weather forecasts that said it was going to rain a lot this week in Thailand. Mainly in the northeast, though, not so much where I am here. Just kind of the northwest, I guess. But as you can see, the rain has stopped and we've got some beautiful blue skies today. As I said, I have a certain restaurant in mind that I want to try out. But as I'm walking through these streets, if I come across a little spot that looks inviting on the way, I can pop in there for lunch as well. We'll just see what happens. As always, I continue to fill my extra time when I'm not walking around the city with a lot of books and movies and TV shows and podcasts. And a podcast that I listened to recently has really stuck in my mind. It was another podcast from one of my favorites, Radiolab. And occasionally, Radiolab puts out a show kind of similar to This American Life, in that, as they say on This American Life, they choose a theme and present a variety of topics based on that theme. And Radiolab did that this time, and the theme was falling. And there was one story in particular they told that really caught my interest. But I'll start at the beginning of the podcast. So the theme was falling, and the very first thing they talked about was how when a person falls, if you're on the roof of a house, for example, and you take a misstep and you fall, or you're riding a bike and you crash, or you're driving a motorcycle or a scooter and you crash, or a car crash, it seems to people like time slows down. They become aware of everything they see around them, and as they're plummeting towards the ground and they know they're about to hit the ground, it's almost like time comes to a stop or slows down, and they can look ahead and anticipate when they're going to hit the ground. So people were interested in this, and one researcher asked himself, what is going on here? Does time actually slow down when you are in these situations? They did a bunch of experiments that I won't go into to test to see if time really does slow down for these people that are falling. And they concluded that no, time itself is unchanged. Time does not slow down or speed up or change in any way. But what they concluded was that your memory changes because our brains have evolved to take in more information when we're in a state of emergency. And that makes a lot of sense. What I mean is that our senses just normally pull in far more data than our brain can process. So they kind of compare our brain to a sieve where you could take a bucket of water with some pebbles in it and you pour that whole bucket of water into the sieve and all of the water flows through. So like 99% of what was in the bucket doesn't get retained. The only things that get retained are the most important things, the big chunks of gravel that don't fit through the screen. And that's how our brain works. There's like a flood of information pouring into our brain at all times, and there's no way we can actually retain all of that information. So our brain lets most of it just flow through, and we don't really notice all this stuff, and keeps only the most important bits of data. But if you are falling or in some kind of an emergency where you risk being injured or killed, our brains know that this is important data. You want to remember what happened so that you can avoid it in the future, for example. So as you're falling, our brains go from being a sieve to being a trap, and it retains all of the information it possibly can for that 1 or 2 seconds that you are falling. So as you think about it later, your memory is of something that lasted for a very long time because your brain retained so much information about the 1 or 2 seconds as you were falling. You remember it, things you heard, everything you saw around you, the sensations on your body, maybe even what you smelled. All of this gets retained in your brain. And then it sort of feels like to you afterwards that as you were falling, time slowed down. But in reality, all that happened was that you just remembered a lot more. So I thought that was really quite interesting. I just passed by something that I thought was interesting, so I thought I'd walk back a few meters just to show it. I've taken an interest in everything in Mesa, coffee shops, restaurants, rivers, canals, and that includes hotels. And I keep seeing signs for that hotel over there. I guess it's part of a large chain in Thailand, the Hop Inn. And just one of those buildings I guess I pass all the time, but I've never really been aware of it. I guess it's so big that as you pass by, you don't really see it. But here from a distance, I can actually see the Hop Inn over there. And I also walked by a little street over here. I think it's a dead end, but just caught my eye for some reason. And I thought I'd walk down here towards the end and see what's going on down here. Oh, just looks like a residential street. I think what caught my eye were these little houses on the side. Made of wood, wooden walls, and then little shops underneath. Oh, we're getting closer to Hop Inn as well. You can see it down there at the end of the street. Very cool street. A lot of the people have greeted me with smiles, and they seem to be from Myanmar, most of the people along this street. And so far, the dogs are leaving me alone. I think I've only passed one so far, and he was just sleeping and ignored me. Yeah, as I said, quite interesting little homes over here on the left. 2-story. I don't know how many of them are occupied. And there's some on this side as well, exactly the same, but they're blocked off by this corrugated fence. And it is a dead end. So turn around and go back. Interesting little detour. It was like a small piece of Myanmar, just being down that street with the people, and just the way they react to me actually made me feel like I was back in Myanmar. I stopped to chat with a couple of people, but they didn't speak enough English for us to really have a conversation. Back to the Radiolab podcast about falling. Another story that caught my eye was also about people physically falling. And the subjects here were the elderly, because it's a very common thing, of course, for the very elderly to fall and break their hip and end up in the hospital. And researchers ask themselves why that is. And you get the usual answers that, oh, well, as you get older, your reflexes aren't very good, there's muscle weakness, your sense of balance isn't as good anymore. And everybody just accepts those reasons because they make sense. But one guy had a different idea about why this happens. And for him, it had to do, again, with the brain and the neurons. And his idea was that it has to do with the changes in speed with which information flows through our neuron, going from our body up to the brain and back down to the rest of our body again. And the idea is that when you're a baby or a child learning how to walk for the first time, what you're really trying to do is get used to how slow our neurons fire. He was saying in this podcast that compared to computers, for example, our brains are unbelievably slow. I mean, our brains are complex, but if you're looking at just the speed with which information travels from our foot to our brain and back again, it's extremely slow. So when you are born and learning how to walk, you are slowly getting used to the delay where your brain is sending signals to your foot, and your leg to take a step, and then the feedback from that step, and you get into a feedback loop, and you eventually become used to how long it takes for this information to flow back and forth. And his idea was that as you get older, the transmission through the neurons actually slows down. It's not as fast as when you were young, and our brain has to adjust to this slower transmission of information. And that is why people fall over more easily when they get older. It's not because they lose their sense of balance or anything like that. It's just because their brain has to adjust all over again to the speed with which information flows. So that was like a brand new idea to me. So I thought that was kind of interesting. The last story in the podcast was the one that I found the most interesting, and it's why it's stuck in my head. And this was not about humans falling. This story was about cats falling. And of course, it's very well known that cats always land on their feet. They have an exceptional sense of positioning in the air, and as they fall, they manage to whip their bodies around very quickly so that they always land on their feet. But a surprising thing is how many cats actually fall out of buildings in places like New York City. they did a study in one place, or no, it was like a veterinary clinic, I guess, had a record of something like 132 cats falling out of buildings in just their neighborhood in one summer in New York City. And that was a lot of cats. And someone studied this about what happens to all these cats when they fall, and there were some very interesting results. Essentially, what they studied was how often and how seriously were the cats injured, and compared that to the heights that they were falling from. And the amazing thing is that cats who fell from, say, 1 to 5 stories were not injured very much. And cats who fell from 9 stories and higher were also not injured very much. But it was the cats who fell from between 5 and 9 floors, those are the ones who suffered the highest level of injuries. And this seemed to make no sense. It's not logical, is it? If you fall from 6 stories, or you fall from 30 stories, you would think falling from 30 stories would damage you a lot more than even a fall from 6 stories. But in their studies of all these cats, that turned out not to be true. And I'm not exactly sure how they did all these experiments to figure this out. But what they learned was that this had to do with terminal velocity. That as the cats start to fall, they're accelerating, of course. They're falling faster and faster until they reach the terminal velocity. And it takes about 9 stories of height for them to reach their terminal velocity. So, if the cat falls from the 4th floor or the 3rd or the 2nd, it's accelerating as it's falling, but it's falling from a relatively low height, and the cat is able to turn around, land on its feet, and because of the relatively low height and just the way cats are built, their skeletal structure and their muscles, they just aren't injured as much as you'd think. I mean, if I fall from 4 stories, I'm injured a lot, but for a cat to fall 4 stories is not so terribly serious. It can survive a fall like that quite easily, just because it's a cat. But when they fall from 5 stories or 6 or 7 or 8 stories, that's high enough to injure even a cat. So when they fall from those heights, cats actually suffer a higher degree of injury. But the interesting thing happens when you get above 9 stories, because as I said, I had a whole group of wild dogs back there, so I've sort of been keeping an eye on them. So above 9 stories, the cat is falling, and until through the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th floor, it's accelerating. And that can be quite disorienting. You know, you're speeding up as you're falling, and when the cat hits the ground, it's still kind of in a state of panic, and it may not be as ready to hit the ground. But above 9 stories, it's falling, it reaches terminal velocity, and then it doesn't accelerate anymore, and the cat starts to relax. It was falling and going faster and faster, but then almost like a skydiver falling from a very great height, it reaches terminal velocity. It's not speeding up anymore, and now it has time to sort of gather its wits, and it kind of looks around and it relaxes as it's falling. They have records of cats falling from as high as 42 floors and surviving without any injuries at all, which is pretty amazing. But again, what's happening is that as it's falling from that height, the cat starts to relax and it spreads out its body. It spreads out its legs as wide as it can and flattens its body, almost like a flying squirrel. So now the cat is falling slower because it's spread out its body so much. The wind resistance means it is falling at a much slower speed. And then when it hits the ground, it's prepared for it, and its whole body is relaxed and kind of spread out, and it absorbs the impact much better. And I don't know if I described the situation as well as the podcast did. I'm sure I didn't. But this really jumped out at me as something I never would have thought of in a million years, that falling from a greater height is safer for these cats only because they reach terminal velocity, they relax, and then when they relax, they sort of take stock of their situation and they spread out their body. It becomes almost like a kite, with a greater surface area, and they slow down and they're not falling as fast anymore. And then when they hit the ground, their body is more capable of absorbing the impact without sustaining injury. So there you have it, the summary of Radiolab's Falling podcast. And I found my little restaurant. And here's a menu of some of the things they make. There's some simple rice and noodle dishes. And then I think this is what caught my eye when I was walking by the other day. It was just a simple bowl of noodles with some meat on top. I'm not sure if that's available because now it seems like there's a time here at the bottom. So let's see what I can figure out. Well, we appear to be all set. Found a nice, comfortable place to sit here. I'm a big fan of chairs that have a backrest. They have a couple of tables here with stools, but they also have a whole bunch of tables with actual chairs, so I'm very comfortable here. And I pointed at the picture of those noodles with, I think, roast pork slices on top. And I was a bit nervous because it looked like it was only available during a certain time of day, but I pointed at the picture and the man behind the counter just smiled and said, yeah, take a seat and we'll prepare it for you. And this is the inside here. The other times that I've walked by, I guess, was more of a standard lunchtime. So it was actually quite busy. Most of the tables were taken. Right now, there aren't very many people here. So I had a choice of all these seats. And that's where the cooking takes place. And I noticed behind the counter, there's another set of pictures of different dishes. So that's kind of handy. For a foreigner like me, I could just point at one of those in the future if I wanted to come back. Another interesting thing about these small places, and especially since the days of the pandemic, they're all tightly linked in with the food delivery services like Panda and Grab just started up in Mesod, I was told. I thought I had seen Grab before, but maybe I didn't. But now I'm definitely seeing Grab motorcycles driving around making food deliveries. Even that little restaurant where I had, that local restaurant where I had noodles the other day, they were sending out far more dishes through delivery services for home delivery than they were making for customers at their restaurant. And they even had some kind of a tablet sitting on a stand near where they were cooking, and I could hear that thing dinging all the time, and when it dinged, the server would go over there, and they were clearly taking online orders. Someone had submitted through their phone or through some kind of an app, and they would read the order from that tablet, prepare it, and then as soon as it was done, someone would show up on a little scooter, whether from Panda or from Grab or some of the other companies, pick it up and take it away to deliver it somewhere. And I assume payment was online as well, because when these guys showed up, I never saw money changing hands. So even that little shop making simple noodle dishes, which you might think is kind of an older, very traditional place to get a meal. They were like tightly connected with online app delivery and that kind of thing. Very modern systems of preparation and food delivery. So it's really kind of interesting. It's not something I've done myself here in Mesa, just because I prefer, if I'm going to eat food from one of these places, it's more interesting for me to leave my guest house room, go out into the city and have a meal in person. But I suppose if I wanted to, I could take the time to learn how these systems work and just order food and have it constantly delivered to my room. Yeah, the modern world. My meal has arrived, my lunch has arrived, and it's actually better than I expected. It looks so tasty. And once more, I had no idea how hungry I was until I had the food right in front of me. So check it out. It's actually a much more elaborate dish than is in the picture out there. So that's kind of cool. So there it is. And it actually has wontons, and then noodles, and then the sliced pork as well. So it has the sliced pork and the noodles like in the picture, but then it has a lot more elements to it as well. So yeah, it looks very tasty to me. Time to try my lunch. Let's go for some of the broth first. And of course, they have chili and spices here, but I haven't added anything, and I probably won't. Nice. It's one of those kind of a sweet broth, not sugary or anything, but it does have a little bit of a sweet flavor to it. So good. Yeah, that is such a funny thing about my psychology. I think this is something else that has caused me tremendous problems in my life in a way. Maybe it's a guy thing, not super in touch with my feelings until something is right in front of me. So it's like I was walking around Mesa babbling into the GoPro, and I could have kept doing that for another 3 hours and I would have been absolutely fine. But the whole time I was practically starving. But I didn't even know how hungry I was until the food was right in front of me. So I guess that ties into the whole you don't know what you've got till it's gone kind of idea, where you really want something but you don't even know about it until it's right in front of you, like my delicious lunch. Some veggies. Some kind of a crunchy, crispy pork. There's a name for that. I don't know what it is. And then slices of pork on top. It's so good. And now, one of the wontons. Very good. Ton of flavor in that wonton. And then underneath, some noodles. I don't anticipate any big surprises about the noodles. Let's give them a taste. Very good. I don't think you can really pinpoint it, but everything in this dish tastes homemade. It has a homemade flavor and a homemade texture. It just sort of feels like it doesn't come out of a assembly line. So even though those noodles have a nice chewy texture to them, Just sort of feel homemade, and the wontons also just kind of taste homemade, if that makes any sense. Okay. Really good. So I'm going to turn off the camera as usual, settle in and enjoy my lunch, read my book, and I'll check back in when lunch is over. Lunch is over. Very good. Just have to pay for my lunch and be on my way. And they have some other things for sale here as well. They've got some sandwiches from somewhere and a few other snacks and things like that. And there's that sign at the back with some other dishes. And here is something of a mystery building, almost like a manor house, colonial manor in a way. All those big pillars in front of the front door. I have no idea what it is, a residential home or something else. The lunch I just had, that bowl of noodles with wonton and the sliced pork and noodles, cost 40 baht. Similar to the dish that I had the other day. I think that was also 40 baht. Another coffee shop. They're everywhere. And this one is the Great Coffee and Tea. Open daily, 9 a.m. till 6. So, if I need a place to hang out, have another cup of coffee, I could always try the Great Coffee Shop. And this is another very interesting place in Mae Sot. I don't hear a lot about it, but I notice it all the time because it's hard to miss when you walk by a hotel and kind of a conference center, perhaps. On the sign over here, says that it has a fitness center, seminar, swimming pool. And it's quite an impressive looking building called The Teak. And right beside it is another upscale cafe and bistro called the Rosewood. And perhaps this should be my next small adventure. There's the sign. Rosewood Cafe and Bistro. It's all about food and mood. Look at that, open 6:30 until 10:30. That's incredible. But obviously a relatively expensive place. But it looks like you could go in there and just have a cup of coffee and enjoy the atmosphere. You wouldn't have to have a whole meal. They even have some tables outside. Yeah, definitely. The Rosewood, I think this will be next on my list. I think it's connected with the Teak. They're part of the same company, I'm fairly certain. All right, Rosewood. So maybe coffee at Rosewood tomorrow. Sounds like a plan. Maybe haircut in the morning, and then to encourage myself to finally get a haircut, I will promise myself a good cup of coffee at Rosewood as a reward for finally getting my hair cut. I'm like a child, you see. I have to reward myself in order to convince myself to do things. So that is it for my video adventures for today. Short walkabout and lunch. And I'll see you in the next video, which sounds like it could be about a haircut or it could be about coffee at Rosewood. It's just a grab bag. See you next time.